In the meantime, let me plug shamelessly my book. I've been told on several occasions that I should speak only 30 minutes or so. 30 minutes, I'm the one who usually gives a 15-minute lecture in about 40 minutes. So I'm going to try to hold it within limits, but in the meantime, the detail that I have to leave out, you'll find it there. Here is a map of Syria. Okay? Syria is a country that, they use the expression that boxes above its weight. In other words, it's a very small country of 22 million people. It has an enormous influence in the Middle East, and part of the reason for that has to do with the strategic position. What I want to do is just sort of like point out a couple of things that are relevant to the uprising that's now taking place. First of all, much of the fighting that's taking place, it takes place in a belt that stretches from Aleppo to Damascus, pretty much in a straight line, and it runs through Homs and Hama. Here's Homs, here's Hama. Like that. That's where the fighting has pretty much taken place. At this point, it appears that the opposition controls much of the north on the Turkish border, around Irbid and all stretching all the way out. In the far west of Syria, what we see is an area that has more heavily Alawite. The Alawite population of Syria, Alawites are considered a heterodox version of Shiism, offshoot of Shiism. The Alawite population makes up approximately 12% of the Syrian population. It's concentrated mainly in this area, but also in the cities as well, particularly in Damascus. When people are talking about maybe this will end up, the uprising will end up in the fragmentation of Syria, what they mean is that it might be possible for this area here to split off. I'm very dubious of that, and I'll explain why I am. This area going out to the east, on the other hand, is heavily populated by Kurds. This area is important for a variety of reasons, one of which is that this is where Syria's oil is concentrated. The fighting has pretty much not taken place in this area. The government has abdicated responsibility for two local Kurdish committees that have been established, and that pretty much run the show at the present time. The other thing we should think of in Syria is the neighborhood that Syria is in. You're all aware, of course, of the Turkish border, but also you have Lebanon, you have the Golan Heights and Israel, you have Jordan, and you have Iraq as well. This is one of the reasons why I doubt that Syria is going to be, that the great powers are going to allow Syria to fragment. It sets a very, very bad precedent for the area, number one. And in addition to that, there's all sorts of, let's say, bad blood between sectors of the Syrian population, let's say, and outside groupings. For example, there are groups within the Kurdish population of Syria that are strongly affiliated with Iraqi Kurdistan, and that means, of course, with Turkey, which Iraqi Kurdistan has, for some bizarre reason, become friendly with. But then again, other groupings here are very, very close to the PKK, which means the Kurdish Workers' Party, which, of course, the Turkish state is now fighting. Overall, statistically, we're dealing with a very small population. We're dealing with a population of 22 million. Just to give you an extent so far of what has happened, 70,000 people are dead. That's the official statistic. We don't really know. So that might go way up, might even be double that number. Okay? We start off with that. 4 years before the onset of the uprising in Syria, there was a drought, which internally displaced approximately 2 million Syrians. Since the onset of the uprising, about 1.4 million Syrians are now internally displaced. And then in addition to that, the UN registers 850,000 external refugees, okay? So 22 million minus 1.4 million minus 2 million minus 850,000 minus 70,000. We're dealing with a population that is totally traumatized at this point. That a population of that at least 20 to 25% has been affected directly by the uprising. That is not going to work.
Is that good?
That's good, but I'm sort of like, I can't wait for the first time I touch the table and it moves. Let me give you a little background about what's going on now in Syria. On the 17th of December in 2010, the world's most famous street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire in a town called Sidi Bouzid, which is in central Tunisia. Earlier in the day, his wares had been confiscated, and when he went to the government ministry to complain, he was humiliated. Strikes and protests broke out throughout Tunisia, and within 10 days, they reached the capital of Tunis. Now, the Tunisians brought a number of issues to the table: unemployment, food inflation, lack of government responsiveness, government repression, etc. This is the sort of demands that we're going to be seeing throughout the series of uprisings that have broken out since December of 2010. At first, the Tunisian government and the President Ben Ali attempted to meet these demands or mollify the protesters in a number of ways. And he did what, again, we're going to see throughout this period of protests. He offered 300,000 new jobs, for example, new parliamentary elections, and a national dialogue. Now, this did very little to mollify the protesters, and within a month or so of the outbreak of the protests, the army had had enough, surrounded the presidential palace, and pulled off a coup d'etat. In other words, they demanded that Ben Ali leave, which he did. His wife left also, stashing $50 million in gold on an airplane. I'm always sort of like, how does an airplane with $50 million in gold take off, you know? Anyway, since that time, Tunisia has undergone a series of changes, some more radical than others. About a week and a half after Ben Ali fled, a group called the April 6th Movement began their occupation of Tahrir Square in Cairo. This was the 25th of January. By the 28th of January, they had to establish their control over Tahrir Square. Strikes again, protests broke out throughout Egypt. Again, a strike wave hit Egypt, and within a very short period of time, actually a mere 18 days, this time the army again had enough. Again, the army pulled off a coup d'etat. Again, the dictator of Egypt was forced to leave, Hosni Mubarak. Okay? This phase of the Egyptian revolution took place in a mere 18 days. Now, this was sort of inspirational to many people throughout the Middle East, and particularly throughout the Arab world. Protests similar to those that took place in Tunisia and Egypt broke out elsewhere. For example, there had been ongoing protests already in Algeria and Yemen, but now they began to take on a brand new form, copying the various techniques, the tactics that were used by protesters in Tunisia and in Egypt. In Bahrain, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, as well as in Morocco, kings who had presented themselves as reformers now faced massive street protests demanding that they reform the system, as opposed to in the republics where the call was for the replacement of the regime, of the nizam. In the monarchies, it has tended to be with the reform of the regime. A day of rage was held in Libya, for example, after the arrest of a prominent human rights lawyer. He represented the families of 1,200 disappeared political prisoners who were disappeared in one single incident in a Libyan prison in 1996. Now, what's going on in Syria? Well, in the midst of all this, Bashar al-Assad gives an interview with the Wall Street Journal. Okay. And in the interview, he says the following, quote, "I am not talking here on behalf of Tunisians or Egyptians. I am talking on behalf of Syrians. We have a more difficult circumstances than in most Arab countries, but in spite of that, Syria is stable. Why? Because you have to be very closely linked to the beliefs of the people. This is the core issue. When there is divergence between your policy and the people's beliefs and interests, you will have this vacuum that creates disturbance. So people do not only live on interests, they live on beliefs, especially in very ideological areas. Unless you understand the ideological aspect of the region, you cannot understand what is happening." Here, what Bashar al-Assad is saying fundamentally is that because Syria is aligned with Iran, is aligned with Hezbollah, is aligned with Hamas in an anti-Zionist, anti-American coalition, that it represents the beliefs of the population far more than, let's say, Hosni Mubarak, whose Egypt was at peace. It had signed a peace treaty with the Israelis. But something was very indicative as well in this interview. He said, quote, "We started reform since I became president, but the way we look at reform is different from the way you look at it. For us, you cannot put the horses before the carriage." Now, that's a rather strange statement, because where else are you going to put the horses? On the carriage, behind the carriage, or whatever. But regardless of that, within 2 months, Syria was in flames. Now, Bashar al-Assad might be forgiven for not really seeing what was going on. A friend of mine wrote an article in the second week of March, which is posted on the website Jadaliyya, which all of you should be reading to keep up with the uprisings. And then the article is entitled, "Why Syria is Not Next." That was the second week in March. In the third week of March, Syria, of course, had begun its descent into hell. Lucky for him, he subtitled the article, "Not Yet, Why Syria is Not Next, at least, so far." Okay. Bashar al-Assad might be forgiven for not seeing what was going on. There were small demonstrations that broke out in Syria in the immediate aftermath of the Egyptian revolution, but they attracted little more than 200 to 300 people and were rapidly mopped up by the security establishment in Syria. But then things began to change. And this is how the Syrian rebellion differs quite a bit from the Egyptian rebellion. It was spontaneous. In the beginning of March, the security services, the worst of the security services, by the way, the Air Force security, which is where Air Force was where Hafez al-Assad came from, they arrested in the town of Daraa, which is way in the south in the Jordanian border. Let's see if I can find it. Here it is. They arrested approximately a dozen school children under the age of 15 for writing "Down with the Nizam," down with the regime, which was a slogan that had originally been used in Egypt. These were kids. Normally, you would expect the police to bring them in, spank them, and then call their parents. But this is Syria, where police don't do that. They were tortured in prison. The parents went hysterical, went out on the streets, and that was when several of the parents were shot, actually. And at the funeral the next day, 20,000 people went out on the streets of Daraa. What makes that even more miraculous is the fact that the city itself consists of no more than 70,000 people. So we're talking a large proportion of the population of Daraa went out. Almost simultaneously, again over a local issue, a spontaneous rebellion broke out in the seaport town of Banias about women who had teachers who had worn the niqab, which was the veil, the Syrian version of the veil, were fired from their jobs as teachers. And what you had was, again, protests, again, firing on the protesters, again, large-scale rebellion beginning to break out. So this is how the rebellion in Syria began. Now, in the very beginning, and lasting to today, actually, the government doesn't call this an opposition movement. The government, of course, calls it, they blame their troubles on an odd assortment of conspirators. First of all, there are the Salafis, who we all know who Salafis are? No. Okay. The way the term is used now is wrong, by the way, because all the political Islamists in the Middle East are Salafis. But what they use the term now to refer to are people whose only who want to follow the Quran and Hadith as a direct roadmap, as a recipe book, for example. Most Muslims in Syria approach their Islam with, sort of like more distance in that way. They're more, let's say, liberal in the sense of how they interpret their Islam. In the case of Salafis, which we see throughout the region, these are people who are far more, think Taliban. Don't think the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. That's probably the best way of saying it. Anyway, these ultra-Orthodox Muslims were blamed. They blamed jihadis. The government blamed jihadis. They blamed ex-cons. They blamed smugglers. And they blamed this marvelous conspiracy, which would have been beautiful to watch if it could ever come together, consisting of the Americans, Israel, Palestinians, Saudi Arabia, and those dreadful Lebanese. Now, what's important about this, about blaming it on Salafis and jihadis and the conspiracy, is that this allowed the government to treat the demonstrators as combatants, not as protesters. And this is something that the government has done relentlessly. Okay? Just as in the case of Libya, there was no policing that the government undertook in Syria. There was no policing that the government undertook in Libya either. It was always combat operations that the government performed against their own people. But something else was going on as well. By claiming that what was going on in Syria at the time, who the opposition was in Syria, calling them Salafis, calling them jihadis, what they were doing is what we call sectarianizing the conflict. In other words, the government, which is very closely identified with the Alawite community, that heterodox community, was now making or defining the conflict as between this particular community, the Alawite community on the one hand, and the majority of Syrians, 75% of whom are Sunni Muslims. Okay. The government, as I said, responded to the uprising with extraordinary brutality. For example, in Daraa, which was one of the first scenes of the conflict, being the birthplace of the conflict, what the government did was initiated a process that it would repeat time and time again in the cities of Homs and Hama and various other cities as well. Now in what they call these villages around Damascus, it's actually Damascus is one big sprawl at the present time. So these are actually suburbs of Damascus. As opposed to being, sort of like villages outside of the city. What would go on in place after place is that the government would cordon off an area, sometimes even a whole city. They would not allow anybody in or anybody out. The army would set up sniper posts. This, by the way, is why demonstrations held in most cities are held at night, because the Syrian army does not have night vision goggles. It's much more difficult for snipers to hit their targets at night. And so therefore what we see is this nighttime sort of phenomenon of mass demonstrations throughout Syria. They would set up sniper posts. They would then, to make sure nobody came in, came out, they would cut off electricity, they would cut off water into the city, and then they would shell cities or large neighborhoods of cities with using either artillery or tanks. They've even wiped whole areas on the outskirts of Damascus off the map. Let me read how CNN described one act that was done by the government. The government does acts of terror. Okay? In the same way, the government did not hide the fact that it tortured those children in Daraa. What Lenin once said about terrorism really rings true for the Syrian government. Lenin said the purpose of terrorism is to terrorize. The whole idea is to scare people. Do you keep acts of terrorism secret? No. You make sure that everybody knows that this is what the government is capable of doing. Anyway, there's a famous story of a young man named Hamza Taib, and let me just describe how CNN describes what happened to him. On April 29, 2012, demonstrators from villages surrounding Daraa, Syria, marched on the city in an attempt to break the Syrian military siege there. On that day, eyewitnesses say security forces fired indiscriminately on them, killing and wounding dozens. Countless others were detained in a mass roundup. Among them, says his family, was Hamza Taib. He got separated from his father in the chaos. A month later, the family received his body. A video was taken at that time by a relative, the family says. Much of the video of the child's corpse is too graphic to broadcast. This was done on CNN. His face was bloated and purple. His body is covered in bruises. There are gunshot wounds to his torso, and his genitals are mutilated. That's how the Syrian government treats its opposition. Now, I gave an interview shortly thereafter in May of 2012 to Jazeera, and they asked me whether or not things could get any worse. And I said, well, I mean, how do you get worse than this? But still, the Syrian government is not using fixed-wings aircraft and is not using multiple rocket launches. Well, silly me. 2 months later, they started using fixed-wing aircraft and multiple rocket launchers against their population. So, the brutality of the government transformed what had started out to be an intersectarian, peaceful protest into something that was worse. It became militarized very, very rapidly and sectarianized as well. The state violence, first of all, sparked defections from the military. The Syrian military, like most militaries in the Middle East, is a conscript military. Since 75% of the population of Syria is Sunni, most conscripts are therefore Sunni conscripts. They get the lousy jobs in the military. Of course, the Alawites get the good jobs in the military. Syrian conscripts did not want to fight shell or actually do close combat with Syrian population centers. So what the government, this defined the government tactic, by the way, of not going into towns and engaging in house-to-house combat, but because you couldn't trust your army to do that, to disengage from the town surrounded and instead shell it from a distance. But the Syrian army parts of the Syrian army began to defect. And among those, as I said, were conscripts who put something together called the Free Officers Movement that was established to protect demonstrators throughout the country. The Free Officers Movement morphed into what we see today, which is called the Free Syrian Army, the FSA. Which is not really an army. Don't be deceived when they talk about either an army or an opposition. There are armies, multiple armies, and multiple oppositions, which is one of the reasons why things have gotten totally out of hand. And since the state is dominated by Alawites, of course, the whole idea of, or the way people began to look at this militarization was through a sectarian lens. Look through it as these Alawites are killing us. And so therefore, increasingly, it became sectarianized. Now, this is how the Syrian uprising appears today. But what I want to do is I want to describe the possible paths that the Syrian uprising can take. Now, first of all, none of us predicted. Bashar al-Assad didn't predict it. My friend didn't predict. None of us could have predicted the beginning of the Syrian uprising. This thing has to do with chance. Or think of it this way. Why was there an uprising in Syria and no uprising, for example, where you would logically think there would be one in Lebanon? Or why was the uprising in Algeria so feeble? Okay? So you're not really able to predict it, but you can predict the various paths that an uprising will take. And those paths are pretty much defined through three factors. The first factor is the local history, the second factor is the state structure, and the third factor is the state capability. Let me give you some examples. Tunisia and Egypt, for example. Okay? Everybody looks at Tunisia and Egypt and says, my God, these states are totally different. You know? Tunisia is very, very tiny in terms of population and size. Egypt is very, very large, 80 million. It's the largest of the Arab states. Tunisia is far more cosmopolitan. When protesters went out on the streets, they shouted at Ben Ali, the president of Tunisia, dégage, get out. You know, when protesters in Egypt went out on the streets, they shouted at Mubarak, irhal, meaning go, but in Arabic as opposed to in French. But the one thing actually that Tunisia and Egypt hold in common, which is very important, is that they're the only two states in the entire Arab world which have experienced 2 centuries of autonomous state building. Okay, they are the only states that actually have existed either autonomously or independently for 2 centuries. And this is important because what that allowed for was in Tunisia and Egypt institutions to be built and to be strengthened. And what that meant, of course, was that there were institutions that could separate themselves from the executive branch, from Mubarak, from Ben Ali, and instead step in when necessary. This is what the army's coup d'etat in both places was all about. The army, as an institution, decided enough is enough. We've got to stop these protests. How are we going to do it? We're going to force the dictators out. The total opposite of Tunisia and Egypt, on the other hand, are Yemen and Libya. Yemen and Libya are brand new states. Yemen didn't even exist as a unified state until 1990. Libya was created in December of 1951. They're brand new. They were put together from disparate parts. There are no institutions in these places. So what would you expect when the uprisings would begin to push against the government? Fragments. It just completely collapses. So this is what we saw in the case of Libya and Yemen. You had pro-government, former employees of the government who took the side of the regime, former employees of the government that went against it. The most important general in the Yemeni army, for example, defected early on to the opposition. So there was no inner core in these countries. So what you ended up with was, rather than the clean, quick, end of the street phase of the uprising that you had in Tunisia, about a month, or that you had in Egypt, 18 days, you had this protracted and extraordinarily violent series of confrontations taking place in Yemen and Libya, both of which were resolved only when outside powers forced them to be resolved. Okay. If we turn to Syria, we see a very, very different configuration, either from Tunisia and Egypt or from Yemen and Libya. Up until 1970, Syria was the most unstable Arab country there was. It had experienced 10 coups d'etats since independence. The first one was brought to you by yours truly. The United States did it in 1949. The next runner-up in the coup d'etat competition, by the way, is Mauritania with 7 coups d'etats taking place. But that all changed when Hafez al-Assad took power in 1970. What Hafez al-Assad did was he coup-proofed Syria. Now, coup-proofing is a technique that has been employed by a number of leaders in the Middle East to make it impossible for either the security apparatus or one branch or another of the military to overthrow the government. It consists of a number of processes, a number of steps. I'm just going to tell you about 2 of them, which are very important in this case. In the case of Syria, what Hafez al-Assad did was he distributed what are called coup-critical positions to members of his family and to members of his sect. In this case, of course, it was the Alawite community of Syria and, of course, Hafez al-Assad's family. So we see to the present day, we see the head of the Presidential Guard is the brother of the president of Syria. We see formerly what we saw was the head of or the associate head of the Defense Council, a guy by the name of Shaukat, Asaf al-Shaukat, was the brother-in-law of the president. I have to say what we formerly saw is not that he was defected, but he was blown up last summer, et cetera, et cetera. What this step of coup-proofing means is the fact that these members of the regime cannot move against the regime. Okay? They are linked to the regime by ties of family, by ties of sect, and it means that if they defect, they're dead. It's as simple as that. There is no place for them to go. And we see this in Syria. If we compare Syria and the uprising that's taking place now to the uprising that took place in Libya. I mean, we were following the Libyan thing, and every day we would get, another 15 diplomats had defected to the opposition, another military commander had defected to the opposition. Fighter pilots, for example, landed their planes on the island of Malta, et cetera, et cetera. We saw this constantly taking place in Libya, not happening in Syria. Not happening in Syria. There have been very, very few defections. The only defections have been people who were window dressing to the regime, nobody who was central to the regime. For example, one or two ambassadors defected. But I got to tell you about Syrian ambassadors. I was once working on a project on Syria. It was about 15 years ago, and so I called up the embassy in Washington. I said, I'm going to be in Washington next week. Can I talk to the ambassador? And I was told yes. So I made an appointment for 10 o'clock in the morning with the embassy of Syria, and I spent 4 hours with the Syrian ambassador just talking shop, basically. She had nothing to do. Ambassadors have no real position. Prime ministers in Syria have no position. This is just window dressing to those jobs that really are important. So what we see now is very, very few defections, and it's going to be impossible for this regime to collapse in terms of one part of the regime moving against another part of the regime, or just splintering, fragmenting itself. Now, the other aspect of coup-proofing that's so important for the way the path of the Syrian uprising is that in order to ensure that sections of the military remain loyal, what you do is you create a number of competing and military units that are not under the same control. So, for example, you have military and security units, some of which are run out of the Defense Department, some of which are directly run out of the President's office, the Presidential Guard, for example. So that if somebody gets ideas, then another grouping will make sure that they can't move. You have multiple security forces. When I told you about, for example, the Air Force security that arrested the children in Daraa, every branch of the military has its own security forces. Now, one of the most horrific aspects of what's gone on in Syria has been one group of security forces. These are hoodlums that have been, in many places in the Middle East, security is outsourced. In other words, because there are so many people necessary in your security apparatus, what you do is you expand your security apparatus far beyond the professionals. So what you do is you make deals with, for example, common crooks, smugglers, people who you say, okay, look, you're going to work for us part-time, you're going to do your smuggling part-time. Okay? It's like that. In Yemen, in Egypt, in Bahrain, you have a group they're called them Baltagiya, which comes, I heard, from the Turkish word meaning hatchet man. Is that true? Can anybody tell me? Anyway, these are thugs, common criminals, who I'm sorry?
What's the word?
In Arabic, it's Baltagiya. Baltagiya. Is that how?
What does that mean?
No, it's j, which becomes a gim. It's a gym. It becomes a game. No, it's okay. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, it's these thugs that have been hired by the government because at a certain point in Egypt there were over 2 million people who were affiliated with the security establishment. This was this massive expansion under Mubarak. And the excuse was Islamists have to be stopped somehow, and so what we're going to do. And then these people just ran riot. They could do whatever they wanted, basically. And those of you who know the Egyptian case of the Facebook site, We Are All Khalid Said, these are the people who beat him up, okay, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of countries have them. In the case of Syria, however, they're called Shabiha, Ashbah. Which for Syrians means ghosts. Okay, these are people who are they dress like ninjas for the most part, in black. The idea, of course, is the purpose of terrorism is to terrorize, so therefore they make the presence known. They are drawn not only from the Alawite community but from the territory around which Hafiz al-Assad originally came, and Bashar al-Assad's ancestral home as well. They're very well trusted by the regime, and they perform the acts that the regime can't trust to conscripted soldiers. They're the ones who initially made the conflict sectarian. Okay. What they would do is they would go into an area to terrorize it. They would just, for example, take over a Sunni village, just massacre the inhabitants. Okay, And then what we got was this tit-for-tat sort of thing going on with various jihadis and al-Qaeda elements coming in and doing the exact same thing to Alawite villages. So it's this back and forth thing that they attempted to do, that al-Qaeda attempted to do actually in Iraq, but actually is taking place now in Syria. So these two aspects of coup-proofing have pretty much laid the path that the Syrian rebellion is going down. How will it end, therefore? If we're talking about the path, what is the possibilities for the Syrian uprising? There's three possible paths for the Syrian uprising. It'll end in one of three possible ways. Either the regime is going to destroy the opposition, or the opposition is going to destroy the regime, or there's going to be a protracted stalemate. Now that sounds really banal, like of course that's what's going to happen. But look at it this way. That did not happen in Egypt, or in Tunisia, or in Bahrain, or in Algeria, or in various other places. It's going to happen in Syria because of the nature of the regime itself. Number one, the regime cannot turn on itself, as I said. So therefore, the regime is pretty much going to fight to the death. Secondly, the opposition also realizes that its days are numbered as well, unless it chooses as well to fight to the very end. Now, the idea of a protracted stalemate is the most interesting one because it's really the only way in which there can be a political solution. A political solution and the idea of finding a political solution to what's going on in Syria is really outlandish. It's not going to happen. But if it does happen, it'll be because two things have taken place. Number one, the government, the regime, on the one hand, and all the various elements of the opposition on the other hand, are going to look around and decide that the situation is hopelessly stalemated, and they have to do this at around the same time. If the government decides that it's stalemated and the opposition doesn't, for example, then the opposition will keep on fighting, and vice versa. Okay? So therefore, they have to simultaneously look at the situation as being hopelessly stalemated. That's number one. Number two, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iran also have to look at the situation as being hopelessly stalemated at the exact same time. As you know, Russia and Iran have taken the side of the regime. We don't really know the extent of Iranian involvement at the present time. There is, a general, for example, of the Revolutionary Guards was killed last week, so we can assume there is Revolutionary Guards fighting in Syria. We also know Hezbollah is in Syria at the present time. The Russian involvement is, again, extremely important for the Syrian regime. Russia has its only Mediterranean base in the port city of Tartus, for example. And, as a result of American diplomacy or Kissinger's diplomacy in the 1970s, the Soviet Union and now the Russians were pretty much locked out of the entirety of the Middle East. This is why the Soviets, by the way, invaded Afghanistan and also looked to find allies in the Horn of Africa. The idea was as a pincer movement, Afghanistan from the north, the Horn of Africa from the south, and what you could do is geostrategically put pressure on the American position in the Middle East. But the Russians, they have a very small group of allies in the region, and this is a very important alliance for them. So they are on the side of the regime, the Iranians are on the side of the regime, the Hezbollahis are on the side of the regime. Okay. The Americans and the Saudis, of course, are on a very different side. They're on the side of, the Americans are sort of on the side of the opposition. The Saudis and the Qataris are, at the present time, arming two different groupings within the opposition. The Saudis are arming the Salafis, the jihadis, within the opposition. They're the ones that the Saudis feel most comfortable with. And this is what the United States gets for outsourcing its foreign policy to the monarch in Saudi Arabia. The Qataris, on the other hand, feel comfortable with the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria. The Saudis never liked the Muslim Brotherhood. They've had troubles with the Muslim Brotherhood, so they're even going more radical than the Muslim Brotherhood. By the way, in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria, God knows where they stand, whether they say they're like the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, that is, willing to play the democratic and human rights game. But, they were obliterated in Syria in 1982, and so ever since then they've been pretty much off the radar screen. Every once in a while they would sign a statement against the government, and then they would retract it and sign a statement hoping to somehow mend fences with the government as well as part of the progressive forces in the Middle East, as they called it. So Saudi Arabia and the Qataris are with the opposition. They're actually doing very, very strong arming of the opposition. The Americans, of course, are sort of with the opposition. When I say that, I mean American policy has evolved. I was asked by Al Jazeera in the beginning of the dispute whether or not, or what American policy was, and I told them basically the Obama administration is very cynical. The Obama administration would probably turn to Bashar al-Assad and say, I don't care how you do it, crush this thing, but do it quickly. Do whatever you have to do, but get it over with. Because as far as the Americans are concerned, the alternatives to Bashar al-Assad is even worse than Bashar al-Assad. Okay? The alternatives perhaps are jihadis, maybe an Islamist government, maybe fragmentation. And frankly, Bashar al-Assad and the Syrians have been very good on one issue that particularly concerns the United States, which is the Israel-Palestine conflict. For all the rhetoric of being part of the anti-imperialist alliance and being against the Israelis and so on and so forth, there has not been one problem on the Syrian border with Israel since 1973. They've kept that border quiet. Okay? So the Americans also want to keep that border quiet. They don't want to see infiltration of jihadis. They don't want to see a breakup of Syria. So in the beginning, when they began to, they moved towards, or they took a more neutral stance. Now the United States is supporting a group that was established by, there are 100 countries. Okay, how do I start off this whole thing? You can't do anything in the Security Council about Syria of the United Nations. The reason for that is because of Libya. Okay? The reason why you can't do anything in the Security Council about Syria is that the Russians and the Chinese stood down when the United States, Britain, and France pushed through a resolution in 1973 calling for a no-fly zone in Syria. Okay? They abstained on that resolution. Now, the no-fly zone quickly morphed into regime change. The no-fly zone quickly morphed into close combat operations that NATO flew in assistance of the opposition. And the Chinese and the Russians knew they were had. And they've also let it be known that nothing is going to go through the Security Council again. So how do you get something, how do you unite countries? Well, you have to do it outside the framework of the United Nations. The United States and other countries set up something called the Friends of Syria. The Friends of Syria set up something called the the National Coalition of Syrian Opposition and Resistance Groups. This is quite a mouthful. Okay. Now, this idea was ostensibly, the idea of this coalition was to unite all the opposition forces together and to create the preconditions for a transitional Syrian government, much as Libya had a transitional government before the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. What really is the reason why the United States and Europeans were particularly anxious to do this was that this would allow them to filter in weapons into the opposition, making sure that the bad guys, as defined by the United States and the Europeans, would not get those weapons, that only those people that we had vetted first would get those weapons. It's not working out that way, of course. It would also, the idea was to unite the civilian leadership, both abroad and in Syria, with the military leadership in Syria, and that has not worked as well. So, what does it take, again, for some sort of political thing solution to work out? Both internal, the opposition and in Syria, as well as the government, have to simultaneously see that that's the only solution to breaking the stalemate. And then all the outside powers that are now channeling weapons into one side or another, the Iranians and Russians on their side, on the government side, the Americans, everybody else, it seems, the Saudis and the Qataris in particular on the other side, they also have to simultaneously stop viewing this as what's called in political science terms a zero-sum game. In other words, the Americans have got to say, okay, it's hopelessly stalemated anyway. A loss for us is not going to be a gain for Russia. And the Iranians have to say, okay, a loss for us is not going to be a gain for Saudi Arabia. So, this is where we are right now. There is no effective leadership of the opposition. There's multiple oppositions that are taking place that are there in Syria, ranging everywhere from, let's say, a liberal opposition movement that we saw emerging in the year 2000 when Hafez al-Assad died. There was something called the Damascus Spring. What you saw was a bunch of liberals, people touting human rights and democratic transition. So that's on one side. On the other side, what you have is various groupings affiliated with Al-Qaeda and various jihadi organizations, the most important of which is called Jabhat al-Nusra, what is usually translated as the Syrian Front, which is a homegrown jihadi organization, as opposed to Al-Qaeda, many of which went over the border from Iraq as well. So, in those terms, what will probably happen in Syria will either be, as I said, one of those two endings, with a win for the regime or a win for the opposition, but very unlikely will there be a fragmentation of Syria. And there's a number of reasons, and I'll close here with why Syria will probably emerge from this as an intact unit, at least in legal terms, in sovereign terms, whether or not in real terms, okay? Number one, the two areas of fragmentation that people are looking at is the Alawite region here and the Kurdish region here. Now, in order to actually have an Alawite region here, what you have to have is an ethnic cleansing of monumental proportions. For example, the city of Latakia, which is the city that many Alawites consider to be the capital of their homeland, is a majority Sunni Muslim. It's not Alawite at all. In the case of the Kurds, for example, again, is a very mixed population. There was a process, an intentional process of Arabizing the East, sending Arabs into the East. At the same time, Kurds were moving out because of the drought for the last 5 years now into various other areas. So what you have is a population, for example, of what used to be the predominantly Kurdish population of Jazeera, the province of Jazeera, which is now 30% Christian. And a large part of the population is also Arab, as well as Christians as well. So we don't know what the ethnic mix is going to be. Very likely, such ethnic cleansing could not take place. The other problem with the idea of fragmentation is the fact that the international community does not like fragmentation. Okay, it sets a bad precedent for other states in the area. Think of it this way. There still is, for example, a Somali ambassador to the United Nations, in spite of the fact that, one would be hard-pressed to find something called Somalia with a functioning government and institutions there as well. So I'll leave you on that and open it up for questions on any aspect of it. And I hope I kept it within certain reasonable length parameters here. So.